بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وبارك على الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. أما بعد فحياكم الله جميعا وبارك الله فيكم. First and foremost, jazakumullah khair for your patience in waiting for the beginning of this lesson, and again apologies for the late start of the lesson. Alhamdulillah, we've reached Hadīth 5, Hadīth al-Khamis, from ʿUmdatul Aḥkām by al-Ghanī, al-Maqdisī raḥimahullāh. And the hadith is an Abū Hurayrah رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: لا يبولن أحدكم في الماء الدائم الذي لا يجري ثم يغتسل فيه. ولمسلم: لا يغتسل أحدكم في الماء الدائم وهو جنب. As this narration mentions on authority of Abū Hurayrah رضي الله عنه that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said that do not urinate in the water, the still water that does not run. Then perform the ghusl within it. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the other wording that do not perform the ghusl, the washing, in the still water whilst he is in a state of janābah. And so, this narration, or these two narrations, are mentioned together, separate wordings. Then remember quickly why we mention, why that you may find, or one of the main reasons you will have a narration with two different wordings. We mentioned it previous lesson, I believe. Now, that if you narrate by meaning, a riwayah bil ma'na, narrated by meaning will cause there to be different wordings. Because if one person narrates by the meaning, then he's narrating by meaning with the words that he uses to understand that meaning. Another person will narrate by meaning with the words that he uses to understand that meaning. Hence, for example, this narration we have, Bayna Aydina, this narration we have here is a narration that has a particular wording which was found in Sahih Bukhari and a particular wording which was found in Sahih Muslim, still referring to the same affair. And Allah Ta'ala knows best. And we mentioned, just min bab al-muraja'a, we mentioned the particular manhaj that you find, the Sharīʿah of a hadith. The one that explains a hadith, there's a manner in which he goes about it. Then remember what that is, how it's done. There's a particular thing. One thing after the other, na'am.
So firstly, he goes through a biography of the narrators, if they're mentioned in the compilation for the first time.
So he goes through the biography of the narrators. Now, so what does he do first before even that?
Before that, it's the takhrij sources.
Before that, the narration itself, and in what manner would he mention the narration? So the first thing he mentions is the narration, and he will narrate, and he will mention narration how? There's two ways to mention narration, possibly.
What's
Repeat the question. How does a person that is explaining the hadith, they will mention the narration first. They bring the actual narration that they're going to explain. How do they bring that narration? In what form?
And sometimes they would put the isnad first, so they're a chain of narration all the way to the Prophet.
Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Na'am.
And then the matan of the hadith.
Jayyid.
And sometimes they would just have the companion that narrated the hadith.
Mumtaz.
If it's a more summarized compilation.
Jayyid. So these are the two ways. As mentioned by the Prophet Jazakallah khair. Either they mention the hadith with its isnad, na'am, all the way to the end, or they will mention the narration and they will make ihtisar, maybe sometimes with a tabi and a companion, but generally speaking, just the companion and then the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Na'am, make sense? Jayyid. After that, what's mentioned after that? The takhrij of the hadith. Where the hadith is found, and generally as well, what is the ruling of the hadith? Is it sahih, hasan, da'if? And so, and the takhrij of hadith is referring to where the hadith is found. After I had takhrij of hadith, The biography of the narrators. If the narration mentions the whole isnad, then they're going to mention the biography of each narrator in isnad. If it's mentioning what? Just the companion and the biography of? Just the companion, of course. So when we say the biography, what is meant by that? Maybe the year of death. What else? So they'll mention, when I say biography, it's not a long compilation, it's not paragraphs. It may be even one word sometimes. Naam, it may be one word, it may be a few words in relation to them. So it might mention, for example, their name in full. Because in the chain of narration, you may find that it just mentions the person's name that they're known by. So for example, in the chain of narration, you might have a Zuhri. It just mentions a Zuhri. Or Ibn Shihab at times as well. Naam. And then it will mention his full name, Muhammad ibn Shihab. Naam al-Zuhri. And then what is the hukm upon the individual as well, the narrator? Is he thiqah? Is he trustworthy? Is he da'if? Is he a weak narrator? Whatever. Now, thereafter, after we've got the biographies, what do we mention? What do we go through after that? Naam, jazakumullah. So then you have the Gharib al-Hadith. The key words or phrases that are found within the narration. The words that are used by the Prophet ﷺ within the narration, what is meant by them? In the context of the narration. The alfaz and the sentences, what are meant by these words. And this affair of Gharib al-Hadith is a science in of itself. And you have books that focus on Gharib al-Hadith by themselves. For example, you have a book which is the well-known book which is referred to as, or is called An-Nihaya, by Ibn Athir. An-Nihaya by Ibn Athir, which is in the science of Gharib al-Hadith. After that, we have the Sharīʿah al-Ijmālī or Ma'na al-Ijmālī al-Hadith, the general meaning of the Hadith. What do you generally understand from this Hadith? After that, finally, of the fawaid from the Hadith. So the benefits, what benefits can we get from the Hadith? Now, there's one thing that is mentioned sometimes as well after the biographies, but it's dependent upon there being a chain of narration. What is that thing? You don't remember? Lata'if al-Isnad. Naam, Lata'if al-Isnad referring to what? Naam, so things that are unique to that chain of narration, or things that are of great benefit in that chain of narration. For example, you may have an Isnad and it's a Sahabi narrated from another Sahabi. That's something that is to be noted. Or it's Musalsal bi thiqat. Everyone is thiqat, everyone is trustworthy in that chain of narration. Then it's to be noted. So something that is noteworthy within the chain of narration as well. So that's something that is mentioned after the biographies, but of course it needs there to be the narration. When the narration is mentioned, it needs to be mentioned with the whole chain. Now that's why it's important to understand when the narration is mentioned in the explanation. How is it mentioned? Is it mentioned with the whole chain, or is it just mentioned with the companion? Now, as for this narration here, barakallahu feekum, as we digress a little bit. With this narration here, we have the mentioning of the hadith narrated by Abū Hurayrah. As for the tarjum of Abū Hurayrah, then this is mentioned in the explanation of the hadith number 2. Now his biography has already been mentioned, and his full name is Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr al-Dawsi radiyallahu anhu. The topic of this hadith, the mawdu' of this hadith, is بيان حكم البول في الماء الراكد واغتسال فيه من الجنابة. So referring to the ruling of the bowl, the urination in the still water, the ruling upon it, as well as can a person use this particular water to perform al-ghusl. And as for the Gharib al-Hadith, the wordings of this hadith, the first is لا يبولن. The word لا يبولن يعني do not urinate. And so, this la in this narration is what's referred to as la an-nahiyah. So the la of prohibition. And the word in yabulanna is a fi'l which is mabni al-fath. Now, so it's a fi'l, it's a verb that is fixed upon a fatha. It has a fatha fixed upon the end, due to the fact that it has a noon on the end, and this noon is the noon of tawqid. Now, the noon of emphasis, which is fixed upon a fatha. It has this noon of tawqid always has to take a fatha. The reason why this noon of emphasis, noon of tawqid, is there is to further emphasize the prohibition of the la. To further emphasize the prohibition. So it's a strong prohibition of this particular action. And thereafter, it mentions ثم يغتسل عفوا الذي لا يجري الدائم الماء الدائم الثابت مستقر. So it's the water that is in one place and it doesn't move. Whilst you have الذي لا يجري لا ينتقل من مكانه بجريان وهو تفسير الدائم. The running water, meaning that it doesn't move from its place. It doesn't run and move from its place. And so this wording here, الذي لا يجري, is tafsir للماء الدائم. It's an explanation and a clarification of the word الماء الدائم. It's an explanation of the wording for الماء الدائم. Thereafter it mentions ثم يغتسل. ثم يغتسل and what's understood from this is an individual does not urinate within this water in which he intends to perform the ghusl with. And so the reason why we have the mentioning of the nahi of the bowl of the urination is to inform us of the ghusl after. So what is not understood from this is that if the water is still, the still water, that the person cannot use that water to perform ghusl. Na'am. What is understood from this is that the still water, the person cannot urinate within that water and then perform the ghusl with it. And this is what is understood from this particular narration. And not that this particular water, because of its state, that it's still water, that the person cannot perform the ghusl. The reason why we say this is that the action of ghusl itself is an action of tahara, an action of purification. And it's sufficient for a person to perform purification as long as the water is what? No. And thus is what? Why, what's this? It's tahir? Tuhur. Na'am. And so the water must be tuhur. The water must be tuhur. As long as the water is tuhur, then al-ghalib. As long as the water is tuhur, then the person is able to perform the ghusl with it. And tuhur, that it's pure within its own self, so you're able to consume it, مثلا, and it purifies other than it. Allah Ta'ala a'lam. Now, thereafter, Shaykh Uthaymeen goes on to discuss the wording Muslim, and that which is found in Sahih Muslim, and it's the hadith mustaqil غير أول. And so it's a hadith in of its own self. It's a hadith in of its own self. So this narration is referring to the ghusl of the janābah. The person being in the state of janābah and performing the ghusl. And Allah Ta'ala knows best. Here as well, you have the la and nahya. You have ya yaghtasil. So it's a la and nahya again. So it's a prohibition. وهو جنب يعني ذو janābah. That the person has janābah, يعني they're in a state of janābah. And so the one that's in a state of janābah is the individual in which it's an obligation for him to perform the ghusl. Naam. And what causes the janābah is يعني the jima', the sexual relations, or the inzal al-mani, or if the person has sexual discharge. Naam, sexual discharge from ejaculation and likes of that. And so these are actions that necessitate the person to perform the ghusl due to the fact that they're in a state of janābah. Allah Ta'ala knows best. Thereafter, we have the general understanding of this narration. And so, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen begins to mention, للشريعة الإسلامية عناية كبيرة في الطهارة والبعد عن أسباب or عن أسباب الضرر. And so within the Sharia, the Islamic Sharia is something that takes care or has a degree of caution over the affair of purification, and that the person is distanced away from anything or any means of harm. And so within this narration, Abū Hurayrah radiyallahu anhu informs that the Prophet ﷺ he emphasized this particular prohibition, that the person urinates within that still water, which doesn't run. لأن ذلك يقتضي تلوثه بالنجاسة والأمراض التي قد يحملها البول فتضر كل من استعمل هذا الماء. And so, due to this narration, the Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited this particular action due to the fact that within this within that urine causes a degree of talawuth, yani pollution of that water, polluting the water, and causing the water to possibly carry illnesses and bring about harm. Now, I bring about harm for anyone that uses that water. So the individual uses that water and it brings harm to them due to the fact that the urine has been carried within it. وربما يستعمله هذا البائل نفسه فيغتسل منه. And it's possible, for example, the one that actually urinated, he uses that water and he uses that water to perform the ghusl, to perform the washing. And so the Shaykh, he mentions, فكيف يبول فيها أو فيما سيكون طهورا له فيما بعد. And so, how is possible for a person that he would urinate within something, whilst obviously there's the need for it to be tuhur, as we mentioned earlier. It's the need for it to be in a state of purity in order for it to be used. And so, likewise, just as you find that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions here the prohibition of washing in this particular water, you find as well that he mentions the prohibition of using water or water that is regarded as being dirty. Along with this, there is a discussion of the person washing and making wudu or purification, any form of purification, using water that is known as musta'mal. Water that's musta'mal. Water that has been used already. So when we say water has been used already, we mean water has been used already for purification. Naam. And that can it be used, or that once it's been used, does it have to be washed away? And what would we say in relation to that, barakallahu feek? Can the person use that water? Is the question clear? Naam. Maymuna. Naam. Narration of Maymuna. So then we say it's jaiz they face from that narration. We have this narration, and we have a narration that mentions the ma'a musta'mal, not using the ma'a musta'mal. Where it mentions not to use the water that has been used previously. I believe it's the narration of Ibn Umar. Nah, it's a prohibition as well. When you have this. Oh, of course, it's different over because there's narration you mentioned, narration I mentioned. So the depth is definitely different over. I'm saying, where do we fall on the difference?
Would it be like an exception for the spouses?
An exception for the spouses? So watch. So it's a point, it can be used as a point. Possibly.
If the water's been used to purify from janābah, and if it's not, that's where the difference is.
For janābah.
So if the water's used for janābah,
yeah.
And then someone uses it after,
yes.
Prohibition there. But if it wasn't used for janābah, then it could be used.
Okay, so if it wasn't used for janābah, then it can be used. Based on this narration and the other narration I was mentioned. But then what about the narration of Maymuna? Because that was for janābah. Okay. Make jam between them somehow. Now, that's sahih. You make jam. And Allah Ta'ala knows best. That the jam is, and Allah Ta'ala knows best, as some of the scholars mentioned, is that the hukm is that it's makruh. It's makruh. And this is generally how you'd understand the ahkam when you have a prohibition of a particular action, and then you have a narration that mentions, for example, the Prophet ﷺ did it. Then we say that the hukm is no longer a hukm of tahrim, but karahiyah. That is, after that, we say that it is makruh, it's disliked. And so that which is afdal, that which takes precedence, is that the person performs, or when they're purifying themselves, that they purify themselves with the water that has not been used before. However, this doesn't affect the purity of the water. Why? Because as long as the water has not changed one of those characteristics, then it can still be used. However, Allah Ta'ala knows best is something which is makruh. Does that make sense? Now, likewise, what about as well, what is mentioned, some of the scholars mentioned the affair of the tabarruk with the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he took his wudu water. Now, he took wudu water in the Nabi Alayhi Salatu Wasallam. And he did not make inkar of them. He did not prohibit them from doing so. Allah Ta'ala knows best. So, as for the fawaid of the hadith, the benefits that we take from this narration, then the first is a prohibition of urination in the ma' ad-da'im, alladhi la yajri. So the prohibition of the person performing, the person urinating in the water that doesn't run, so the water that's still water. And this nahi is a nahi li-tahrim. And this prohibition is one of tahrim. Why? Because the people may use that water. And so the Sheikh of him, he mentions that it's a nahi li tahrim. It's a nahi for it's a prohibition, yeah, that is haram if the people use it. So if the people use the water, it's haram. If not, then it is makruh. النهي فللكراهة. And the Shaykh, he mentions as a final point on this fa'idah, والغائط كالبول بل أشد منه. And the غائط, so the excrement, is like the urination, the urine. Rather, it is even more so, even more severe. The second benefit we can take from this is جواز البول في الماء الذي يجري. And so the second is that it's permissible to urinate in water that is running water. Why? Because the water, the urine will run with the water and wash it away. لكن إن كان في أسفل الماء أحد يستعمله فلا يبولن فيه لأنه يكثره عليه. However, if within that water is, or at the bottom of that water then, is being used by the people, or the water is being used by the people, then again this prohibition occurs. Why? Because the illah, or the prohibition, the main reason for the prohibition is the talawwuth of the bowl, the pollution of the urination, and that may bring harm to the people because the water is being used. That's the illah, that's the reason for this prohibition. So if that reason still remains, that this water is being used, then the person must avoid this action. Allah Ta'ala knows best. The third benefit we can take is النهي عن الاغتسال في الماء الدائم من الجنابة. The third is the prohibition of washing, using the still water whilst in the state of janābah. And Shaykh of him goes on to mention, وَالنَّهِي لِلتَّحْرِيمِ إِنْ كَانَ يُفْسِدُهُ عَلَى مَنْ يَسْتَعْمِلُهُ مِنَ النَّاسِ. And so this nahi, this prohibition, necessitates that it's haram if the individual, essentially he pollutes the water for those that would use it. Again, so this prohibition is in relation to the one that's using it. As for if it's not being used, then it's makruh. It's makruh. So if it's water that is generally used, then it's haram. If it's water that isn't generally used, then it's makruh. Why? Because even though it's not generally used, it's no longer possible for it to be used because of that action. The fourth benefit, barakallahu fikum, is جواز الاغتسال من الجنابة في الماء الداري، من الماء الجاري عفوا، في الماء الجاري. And so the fourth is the permissibility of one's washing, the first form of the ghusl from janābah, using the running water. It's permissible to do so. And the fifth benefit is كمال الشريعة الإسلامية لإنايتها بالطهارة والبعد عن أسباب الضرر. And the fifth benefit is that the Sharia is one which is complete and perfect to the extent that it seeks to protect from any forms of harm and any means of something that can harm a person. Naam. Thereafter, Shaykh Uthaymeen, he mentions a point. So he mentions for then he mentions a point that needs to be taken into consideration, the tanbih. And he mentions raḥimahullāh, ظاهر الحديث لا فرق بين الماء الكثير والقليل. For that which is apparent, that there's no difference between that which is a large amount of water or a small amount of water. لكن النهي في قليل أوقد لأنه أسرع تلوثا وتغيرا، والماء كثير جدا الذي لا يمكن أن يتأثر بالبول أو التلوث بالاغتسال كماء البحر لا يدخل في النهي. And so he mentions, as for if it is a small amount of water, and the smaller the amount of water, then it's even more so that there is a prohibition. And the greater the prohibition, the greater the emphasis. As for large amounts of water, he mentioned الماء كثير, large amounts of water, for example, the water of the sea. Now, of course, this is الماء كثير. It goes as far as I can see. Now, as for larger amounts of water, then this water is not able to be polluted by one person urinating, for example. Now, and so, or one person performing the ghusl within it. And so, due to that, then it does not enter within this particular prohibition. وَأَمَّا الْمَاءُ الدَّائِمُ لفترة معينة كالماء البرق التي في البساتين، فإن كان يمكن أن يتأثر بالبول أو يتلوث بالغسل لقلته وبطء ورد الماء الجديد عليه، فإنه داخل في النهي، وإلا فلا يظهر دخوله فيه. As for other water, for example, the waters that you find in the lakes and the ponds, in the parks and the likes of that, the parks and the gardens, or waterfalls in the gardens and the likes of that, then if it's possible for this water to be affected, for example, affected by the one that's performing ghusl in it, naam, or is affected by the one that urinates within it, if it's possible for it to be affected due to the fact that it's a small amount of water, then it enters within this narration. If it's large amounts of water, then it does not enter into this particular narration and is not regarded as being water which is impure. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And we'll conclude here with this particular part of the book, inshallah, and continue in our next lesson, bi'idhnillah, inshallah next week. Wallahu a'lam. Jazakum Allah khairan wa barakallahu feekum. Wa sallallahu wa barak ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.